My name is Lena Porter. I'm 33 years old, and I make a living welding steel into shapes people call art. But before all that, before the sound of sparks and the smell of metal became my heartbeat, I was the quiet shadow at my own family celebration, the girl everyone forgot to clap for. The night it happened, the world around me looked golden. Strings of fairy lights glowed in my parents' backyard, champagne corks popped like fireworks, and a banner stretched across the patio reading, "Congratulations, Ethan." My cousin had just been accepted into law school, and my parents decided this was history in the making. They rented heaters, hired a jazz trio, and ordered a cake shaped like a gavel. You'd think the mayor was coming. But I was there too, standing behind the crowd, near the fence where the light didn't quite reach, holding a lukewarm cup of lemonade that had lost its fizz hours ago. I remember watching my cousin make his rounds, shaking hands like a politician, while everyone talked about his bright future. Someone said, "He's going places." And I thought, I've been working my whole life just to stand still. Sit back, relax, and stay with me until the very end of this story. And hey, before we start, don't forget to hit subscribe so we can keep sharing stories that remind you you're not the only one who's ever felt invisible. Now, back to that night. 2 weeks earlier, I had finally passed my welding certification exam. It took 2 years of night classes, weekends working double shifts, and more burned sleeves than I could count. I texted my parents a photo of me in my safety gear, smiling like a fool, sparks flying in the background. My mom replied with a single line, "That's nice, honey." My dad didn't reply at all. He just called later to ask if I could fix the loose hinge on the garage door. So there I was, watching them raise glasses for Ethan's future, while my own accomplishment, the one I'd bled and sweated for, had barely registered. The air smelled like roasted chicken and celebration, but to me it was heavy, like breathing through disappointment. I told myself not to care, but it's hard not to when you see the look of pride you've been chasing your whole life shining in someone else's direction. Ethan looked the part of success. Tall, clean-cut, wearing a navy blazer that probably cost more than my entire toolbox. He talked about scholarships, internships, professors who'd already taken notice of him. Every sentence was another reminder of who he was to them, the golden boy, the family's miracle. People clinked glasses. My mom wore pearls I hadn't seen since her anniversary. My dad was giving a toast, saying things like, "We always knew he'd make us proud." I caught the words hard work and dedication and almost laughed. Did they even know how hard I'd worked? The band started playing a soft cover of Sweet Caroline, and the whole room swayed together, tipsy on pride and Prosecco. I slipped out the side door. The night air was cold, sharp enough to sting. I sat on the porch steps, looked at my hands, small burns across my knuckles, nails rough, skin dry from heat and grit. Hands that built things, hands that held fire. But those weren't the kind of hands my parents bragged about. Out there, I could still hear them cheering for Ethan through the walls. I thought about how easily the world celebrates some people, how quickly it gives applause to polish, not perseverance. Inside, they saw Ethan's promise. Out here, I was living proof of follow-through. But no one noticed. I pulled my phone from my pocket, scrolled through the photos of my certification day. There I was, grinning beside the welding machine, soot on my face, pride glowing under fluorescent light. I almost posted it to Facebook with the caption, "Certified welder at last." But I already knew what would happen. 10 pity likes, a few good-for-you comments, and then silence. Nothing compared to the standing ovation Ethan would get for simply existing with potential. So I deleted the draft and sat in the quiet, listening to the faint hum of traffic beyond the trees. For a long moment, I felt like disappearing altogether, like maybe invisibility was the role I'd been assigned since childhood. Then something inside me shifted, just slightly, like a spark catching in the dark. Maybe it was anger. Maybe it was the beginning of clarity. I realized I didn't actually want their applause. What I wanted was something they couldn't give me, proof that what I was building mattered, even if nobody else saw it yet. I stayed out there for a while, watching my breath curl into the cold. I thought about every dinner conversation that had revolved around Ethan's grades, his internships, his endless promise. I thought about every time I'd been told I was practical instead of brilliant, helpful instead of talented. Words that sound like compliments until you notice the ceiling built into them. By the time I stood up to leave, I'd made a quiet vow. The next time they gathered to celebrate, it wouldn't be because I was standing in the background. It would be because they couldn't ignore me anymore. When I walked back inside, Ethan was taking a photo with my parents, all three of them beaming. I smiled politely, grabbed my coat, and told them I was heading home. Mom kissed my cheek distractedly. Dad pressed leftover cake into my hand, already turning back to Ethan. I drove home with the radio low and the windows cracked open, letting the night air wash over me. The roads were empty, slick with rain. Somewhere between the blinking streetlights and the quiet hum of the engine, a thought landed so firmly I almost laughed out loud. They think I'm done? I'm just getting started. That night didn't break me. It branded me. And like any good welder knows, some things only hold strong after they've been through the fire. Quick question for you. If your family ignored your biggest accomplishment, what would you do? A. Walk away and prove yourself in silence. B. Keep trying to earn their approval. Comment A or B below. I want to know which one sounds more like you. I grew up in Portland, Oregon, in a house where the walls echoed with polite conversations and quiet expectations. Ours was the kind of family that looked perfect from the outside. Sunday dinners, neatly trimmed hedges, and matching Christmas sweaters. But beneath that polite surface, comparison lived like a ghost that never stopped whispering. I learned early on that being loved wasn't the same as being seen, and being seen didn't always mean being valued. From the time I was 5, there was a rhythm to how our family worked. My cousin Ethan was the prodigy, the miracle child who could do no wrong. Teachers adored him, neighbors bragged about him, and my parents, well, they practically glowed whenever he walked into a room. He was the kind of boy who played piano without being told to practice, who answered questions before teachers finished asking them, who wore his good fortune like it was genetic. And me? I was the one holding the camera, taking the pictures that would hang on someone else's wall. I don't think my parents ever meant to make me feel small. They were just proud in a specific direction. When Ethan got straight A's, they framed his report card. When I got straight A's, they said, "That's nice, honey. Keep it up." The difference was only a few words, but when you're a kid, tone becomes truth. I grew up learning that excellence was expected, not exceptional, and that the spotlight only ever pointed one way. There was this one summer when I was 10, a memory I still carry like a bruise that never fully healed. My dad had an old pile of lumber stacked behind the shed, scraps from a renovation project he'd never finished. I spent 2 weeks dragging those pieces across the yard, sanding them down, measuring and cutting with a small handsaw that used to belong to my grandfather. My plan was to build a treehouse, not one of those plastic kits or Pinterest-perfect versions, just something sturdy, a space that belonged to me. When it was finished, it leaned a little to the left, but it held. I was proud. My arms were sore, my palms blistered, but I had built something from nothing, and that felt like magic. I ran inside, breathless, calling for my parents to come see. My mom peeked out the window, smiled faintly, and said, "That's nice, sweetie." My dad looked for a moment, then said, "Maybe Ethan can paint it for you. He's good with colors." I remember nodding even though something inside me twisted. A week later, Ethan painted it sky blue, and everyone clapped. My mom called it Ethan's creative summer project. My name wasn't mentioned. That treehouse stayed in the yard for years, fading under rain and sunlight, and every time I saw that chipped blue paint, I remembered what it meant to be almost good enough. That was the rhythm of my childhood, me building, him being celebrated. If Ethan joined a science fair, he came home with a ribbon and a headline in the church bulletin. If I fixed the toaster, it was helpful. If I sketched designs for furniture or tinkered with engines, it was messy or dangerous. I didn't realize it then, but my worth in that house was measured in utility, not brilliance. Ethan made people proud. I made things work. Even our summers followed the same script. Ethan went to debate camp, and I stayed home to help my dad repaint the porch. He came back with stories of mentors and competitions. I came back with paint stains and a reminder to clean my brushes better next time. Our family photo albums became a study in imbalance. Ethan on stages, holding certificates, surrounded by applause. Me somewhere in the background, usually holding tools or wearing work gloves. I don't remember when I stopped expecting applause. Maybe it was around middle school, when Ethan got a telescope for Christmas because he said he liked astronomy. I got socks and a reminder to write him a thank you note for the gift he gave me. A notebook that said, "Dream big." It was ironic, really. I already dreamed big. I just didn't dream in ways people could frame or brag about at church. My dreams were practical, tactile, made of bolts and sparks and the smell of machinery. I wanted to build things that lasted. I wanted to leave marks that couldn't be erased with a shrug. But when you grow up in someone else's shadow, even your dreams start to shrink to fit the available light. I learned to aim low so I wouldn't disappoint anyone. I became the girl who didn't ask for much, who nodded and smiled and said sure when told what to do. I was dependable, useful, invisible in the safest way possible. My parents trusted me to handle things because they didn't worry about me succeeding. They assumed I'd be fine, and in their minds, fine was enough. In high school, the pattern sharpened. Ethan joined student government. My mom made a scrapbook. I joined the shop class. She asked, "Are there any girls in that?" Ethan got his driver's license on the first try. I'd handed him the keys to the family car with a grin and a pat on the shoulder. When it was my turn, he just tossed me his old truck keys and said, "Try not to wreck it." There was no malice, just that steady undercurrent of expectation that my life would orbit around practicality while Ethan's reached for the stars. But sometimes invisibility breeds clarity. When you're the quiet one in the corner, you start noticing things other people don't. I saw how easily praise can become pressure. I saw how being the golden one trapped Ethan just as surely as being overlooked trapped me. He was constantly performing for approval, terrified of slipping. I, on the other hand, had nothing left to lose. That kind of freedom comes slowly, disguised as neglect. Still, the ache stayed. Every time my dad said, "You're just like your mother," steady, I heard, "You're not special." Every time my mom said, "You're such a big help," I translated it into, "You're replaceable." I wanted them to see that building, fixing, and creating weren't consolation prizes. They were my language, my way of speaking to the world. But in a family obsessed with appearances, results only mattered if they came with applause. By the time Ethan left for college, I had already decided not to follow him into that world of endless validation. I took odd jobs instead: cleaning, waitressing, changing tires. Work that kept my hands moving, my mind busy. Work that made sense. But even then, I carried the weight of those years. Every "that's nice" still echoed in my head like a half-finished song. Sometimes I wonder if my parents even realized the pattern they'd built. Maybe they thought they were protecting me from disappointment by not setting expectations too high. Maybe they believed I'd find contentment in the background. Or maybe they just didn't see me at all, not out of cruelty, but out of habit. People get used to the version of you they first met, and it's easier to keep you there than to see you change. Looking back now, I don't hate them for it. They were doing the best they knew, loving the loudest voice in the room because it was easier to hear. But those years shaped me in ways I didn't understand until much later. They taught me how to survive without praise, how to build without blueprints, how to find meaning in the quiet. They made me resourceful, resilient, maybe even relentless. And though I didn't know it yet, all those small unseen moments, the treehouse, the porch paint, the silence after my successes, were forging something inside me stronger than I realized. They were building the foundation for the woman who would one day take fire in her hands and make something beautiful out of it. By the time I turned 27, I had already collected more name tags than friends. Waitress, cashier, gas station clerk, tire changer, each job another line on a resume that read like a list of things I did to stay afloat. My parents never asked how I was doing, just whether I was saving anything. Ethan was in graduate school by then, his photo on some university newsletter about future leaders in law. My mom printed it and pinned it to the fridge. My name, meanwhile, never made it onto anything magnetic. I wasn't bitter exactly, just tired. Tired of proving my usefulness instead of my worth. The world, I'd begun to notice, doesn't applaud people who fix broken things. It only claps for those who build something shiny and new. So I drifted through my 20s with that kind of hollow numbness that feels like survival disguised as acceptance. Then one late afternoon, something changed. Something so small it shouldn't have mattered, but it did. It was a Tuesday. I was working at a hardware store on the industrial side of Portland, stocking shelves of screws and welding rods. A man came in frantic, carrying a bent metal frame from a bicycle. "You think anyone here can fix this?" he asked. I don't know why, but I said, "Let me try." I took it into the back, borrowed the store's old welding torch, and spent 20 minutes fusing the brake back together. When I handed it back, he looked at the joint, then at me, and said, "You've got steady hands." He paid, thanked me, and left. But the phrase stayed. That night, I couldn't sleep. The glow from my phone screen lit up a tab I hadn't closed, an ad for night classes at a local trade school. Learn welding. Build a career with your hands. I stared at it for a long time. I'd always known how to make things, but the idea that it could be more than a hobby felt almost dangerous, like wanting too much. Still, I filled out the application before I could talk myself out of it. The first night of class smelled like burnt steel and coffee. The instructor, a broad-shouldered man named Wayne, had the kind of voice that could cut through machinery. He handed me a helmet and said, "This job will humble you. You'll get burned, you'll sweat through your clothes, and the day you think you know everything is the day the metal reminds you you don't." I loved him instantly for his honesty. Learning to weld wasn't graceful. It was blistered fingers, melted gloves, and the hiss of gas that sounded like it was breathing for me. The first time I struck an arc, the light was so bright I flinched. The second time, I held my ground. By the third, I felt something click, a rhythm between my heartbeat and the steady crackle of electricity. It wasn't easy, but it was real. Every spark was proof that I existed, that I was shaping something from nothing with my own hands. For 2 years, I balanced those classes with 2 jobs. I'd spend mornings at the hardware store, afternoons waiting tables at a diner, and evenings in a workshop filled with noise and fire. There were nights I drove home with my arms shaking from exhaustion, parking in front of my apartment too tired to climb the stairs. My rent was late more than once. My meals were often cereal or toast, but there was pride in that hunger. It meant I was feeding a different part of myself. Still, my parents barely noticed. When I mentioned the course to my mom, she said, "As long as it keeps you busy, sweetheart." To her, welding sounded like a phase, something between odd and unnecessary. My dad's only question was, "Is that safe for a girl?" He said girl, not woman, and something about that word shrank me again. But I kept showing up. Every class, every weekend, every late night practicing on scrap metal behind the school building. I burned through my gloves faster than anyone, but my welds started to look cleaner, my seams tighter. Wayne noticed. "You work like someone who's got something to prove," he said once. I wanted to tell him he was right, but I didn't. I just nodded and went back to the torch. The day of the final certification test felt like standing on a cliff. We were told to build a joint that could withstand 2,000 pounds of pressure. One crack, one flaw, and it failed. I remember my hands trembling as I started, sweat pooling at the base of my neck despite the cold air. But once the metal started glowing, the nerves faded. There was just focus, heat, movement, breath. When the inspector finally checked my work, he looked up and said, "Solid weld." 2 words. But they meant more than any compliment I'd ever received. I drove home that night with the windows down, the certificate on the passenger seat, and the smell of burnt metal still clinging to my jacket. For the first time in years, I felt something like freedom. Not happiness exactly, something deeper. Purpose, maybe. Proof that I could choose a direction and make it real. I stopped by my parents' house the next morning, certificate still rolled in my bag like a secret. My mom was sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through her tablet. "Guess what?" I said. "I passed my welding certification." She looked up for a second, smiled politely, and said, "That's great, honey." Then she went back to her screen. My dad came in from the garage, heard what I'd said, and asked, "Since you know welding now, could you look at the gate latch? It's been sticking." That was it. No hug, no dinner out, no photo on the fridge. I left the certificate on their counter for a moment, thinking maybe they'd ask to see it. They didn't. I rolled it back up and slipped it into my jacket pocket on my way out. Back home, I sat at my kitchen table with a slice of store-bought pecan pie and a paper cup of cheap coffee. The combination tasted like exhaustion and small victory. I remember whispering, "Congratulations, Lena," to myself, then laughing at how ridiculous it sounded. But someone had to say it. That night, I walked down to the river, the city lights reflecting off the water like tiny sparks. I thought about Ethan in some bright classroom across the country, his life already scripted with applause. Then I thought about my own script. Blank, wide open, waiting for someone to write it. That someone, I realized, could be me. I didn't know yet what I was going to build or how I'd make it happen, but I knew this. I was done asking for permission to be proud of myself. I had held fire in my hands and turned it into strength. That was enough to start with. In the distance, a train passed, its horn echoing through the dark. The ground vibrated under my feet, a low hum that felt like possibility. I closed my eyes and made a quiet promise that this certificate wouldn't be the end of something small. It would be the beginning of something I'd build with my own fire. The moment everything shifted wasn't loud. It didn't happen in a burst of anger or a storm of tears. It came quietly, like a crack forming in ice, a sound you almost miss until it spreads and changes the whole surface beneath you. For me, that sound was my father's voice drifting from the kitchen one gray Sunday afternoon. I was home for dinner, sitting in the laundry room fixing a loose hinge on the dryer door. The smell of roast chicken filled the house, the same scent I'd grown up associating with family gatherings. Through the half-closed door, I could hear my parents talking while they set the table. "She's good with her hands," my mother said, in that soft, practical tone she used when she wanted to sound encouraging but not too hopeful. My father sighed. "Sure, but good with your hands doesn't get you anywhere these days. Welding isn't exactly a career, you know." He said it the same way someone might comment about the weather. Calm, certain, harmless. But those words slid under my skin like hot wire. It wasn't the first time they'd said something like that, but that afternoon, something in me refused to let it pass. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just stared at the hinge I'd been tightening, the metal cold and stubborn beneath my fingers. I remember thinking, they don't hate what I do. They just don't think it matters. And that realization hurt more than any insult ever could. When dinner was ready, I washed my hands, sat at the table, and smiled through the meal as if nothing had changed. But something had. Deep inside, a decision was forming, quiet but fierce. If they couldn't see value in what I built, I'd build something so undeniable they'd have to. That night, back in my small apartment, I pulled out a stack of old notebooks. Most were filled with half-finished sketches. Metal gates, abstract sculptures, odd furniture designs. I started flipping through them, page after page, until I landed on one drawing I'd done years ago of a workshop. It had big windows, a tall garage door, and a sign on top that read Copper and Flame. I'd written the name as a joke, but now, staring at it under the yellow glow of my desk lamp, it didn't feel like a joke anymore. It felt like a challenge. I couldn't sleep. My head spun with possibilities. How I could lease a small space, what equipment I'd need, how much money I'd save from my jobs. I opened my laptop and started searching for industrial spaces for rent in Portland. Most were too expensive, too big, too far. But one listing caught my eye. Old muffler shop, needs work, cheap rent. The photo showed a squat building with peeling red paint and an overgrown lot. It was ugly. It was perfect. The next morning, I drove out to see it. The place smelled like dust and oil and forgotten potential. The floor was cracked, the walls streaked with rust, but I could see it, my future, standing there beneath the broken fluorescent lights. The landlord, a tired-looking man in a flannel jacket, seemed surprised I was serious. "You sure you want this dump?" he asked. "Most people just ask if they can park their junk here." I told him I wasn't most people. 2 weeks later, I signed the lease. The day I got the keys, it was raining. The kind of Oregon rain that soaks you through in seconds. I stood in the middle of that empty, echoing space, dripping onto the concrete, and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Ownership. This was mine. My mess. My chance. The first few weeks were brutal. The roof leaked in 3 places, the wiring was a nightmare, and the back door wouldn't lock properly. I spent every evening after work there, scrubbing oil stains off the floor, sanding down rusted benches and rewiring lights with YouTube tutorials as my guide. I didn't have fancy tools or a business plan, just determination and a stubborn refusal to quit. There were moments when the exhaustion hit so hard I had to sit down in the middle of the floor and just breathe. Sometimes I'd laugh out loud at how ridiculous it all was. Me, the invisible cousin, trying to build a business out of a crumbling garage. But every night, when I turned off the lights, I looked back at that space and felt it changing, inch by inch, into something alive. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't tell Ethan. I wanted this to exist without their opinions, without their disbelief. For once, I wanted something that belonged entirely to me, untouched by comparison or commentary. I'd already spent half my life chasing their approval. This time, I was chasing freedom. When I wasn't cleaning or repairing the space, I was planning. I drew logo ideas on napkins, researched small business permits, watched videos about welding art and fabrication. I worked overtime at the hardware store to save up for new tools. I sold my old car to buy a second-hand welding machine from a guy on Craigslist who looked like he lived inside his garage. It sputtered when it ran, but it worked. That was all I needed. One night after weeks of cleaning, I finally hung my first sign, handmade from a scrap of steel I'd polished and spray painted myself. The letters weren't perfectly even, but they gleamed in the light of my work lamp, copper and flame fabrication. I stood there for a long time, staring at it, letting the weight of it settle into my chest. I wasn't waiting for applause anymore. I wasn't even waiting for success. I was just here, building something real. That winter was one of the hardest of my life. The heater barely worked, my savings were running low, and I spent most nights eating cheap ramen on an upturned milk crate. But even in those quiet, freezing hours, there was a fire in me that no amount of cold could touch. I'd come home covered in soot, my hands raw and shaking, but I'd fall asleep smiling because every scar meant progress. Sometimes I'd catch my reflection in the shop window, hair pulled back, welding jacket dusted with ash, and I barely recognized myself. I didn't look like the girl from my parents' dinner table anymore. I looked like someone who had stopped waiting for permission. As the days grew shorter and the nights colder, I started to imagine what might come next. Real clients, custom projects, maybe even a small team one day. But more than that, I imagined walking into that shop years later and feeling proud of what I'd built. Not because anyone else cared, but because I had made it with my own hands. People talk about turning points like they're explosions, but for me, it was quieter than that. It was a slow ignition, a spark that became a flame, one I refused to let die. Every scrape of sandpaper, every bolt tightened, every drop of sweat was a declaration. I am here. I matter. I'm not the background anymore. When I locked up one night, I stood outside under the pale glow of the streetlight, watching my breath form clouds in the cold. Behind me, the shop hummed with stillness, smelling faintly of metal and rain. I whispered to myself, this is just the beginning. And even though no one else could hear it, I knew that somewhere deep inside, the fire had already caught. The winter I opened Copper and Flame was the kind that makes you question every decision you've ever made. The sky hung low for weeks, a dull gray blanket pressing against the city. Every morning, I could see my breath hang in the air as I unlocked the shop door, fingers stiff inside torn gloves. The space smelled of cold metal, oil, and dust, the scent of something waiting to be reborn. I'd stand there for a moment, watching the faint light spill through the grimy windows, and whisper to myself, all right, Lena, let's see what you've got. Money was tight. Tight in the way that made you calculate whether you could stretch oatmeal and canned soup for another 2 days. I'd poured nearly every dollar I had into rent, welding rods, paint, and a space heater that groaned like it had asthma. But the lack of comfort made every small victory feel monumental. The first night I managed to fix the flickering overhead lights, I sat on the floor under their glow and laughed until I cried. It wasn't much, but it was proof that something broken could work again. Maybe that included me. I spent those early months learning how to live inside the rhythm of creation. I'd arrive before dawn, light up the torch, and lose myself in the blue glow of the flame. The hiss of gas, the crackle of molten steel, the smell of smoke, they became my morning prayer. I worked until my shoulders ached and my knuckles cracked. The only thing that kept me company was the old radio Wayne had given me when I left the trade school. Its antenna was bent, its sound fuzzy, but every time Fleetwood Mac or Johnny Cash played through the static, I felt less alone. My first real job came from a man named Tanner, who owned a cafe on the east side of Portland. He came by one afternoon after seeing my hand-painted sign out front. "You do custom work?" he asked. I hesitated before saying yes, even though I had no clue what custom work would entail. He wanted an iron gate for the cafe's small patio, something decorative but sturdy. "We've had 3 break-ins this year," he said. "If I'm going to lock people out, I at least want it to look good." For a week straight, I poured every bit of skill and imagination I had into that gate. I designed curling leaves along the bars, welded a subtle coffee cup silhouette into the center, and polished it until my arms burned. When I delivered it, Tanner stood back, folded his arms, and said, "That's not a gate, that's art." He paid me more than I'd quoted, added a generous tip, and insisted on tagging my shop's Instagram handle in a photo post. I didn't even have an Instagram page then. I made one that night. That single post changed everything. A local florist messaged me asking for a decorative sign frame. Then a couple wanted custom railing for their porch. Each job felt like a lifeline thrown into the dark. Some weeks I'd work 14-hour days, other weeks I'd go days without a single order. But slowly, word spread. The woman from the flower shop told her sister, who told a restaurant owner, who called me to build an outdoor sculpture. I wasn't just fixing things anymore. I was creating beauty that people could see. But even as the shop came to life, the loneliness still lingered. I'd go days without hearing another voice besides my own muttering through the noise of grinding metal. One Saturday, as I was closing up, I noticed someone standing by the door. It was a woman about my age, holding a flyer from the trade school. "You're Lena, right?" she asked. "Wayne said you started your own place." Her name was Marisol. She'd taken the same welding program but dropped out after having her second child. She said she missed the work but didn't think she could manage both kids and school. "Come by on weekends," I told her. "Bring the kids if you need to. I'll teach you what I can." That was how it began. Her showing up on Saturdays with her youngest napping in a stroller while we worked side by side. We welded small projects, sold a few pieces online, and shared sandwiches in between sparks. Sometimes when the baby cried, I'd take over rocking the stroller with one boot while she finished a weld. It was chaotic, messy, and somehow beautiful. For the first time, Copper and Flame wasn't just mine. It was alive with shared purpose. Winter turned to spring, and the shop began to change shape. The empty shelves filled with orders waiting for pickup, the walls lined with sketches and photos of finished projects. I built new tables from reclaimed wood and steel, hung Edison bulbs that cast warm light over the machines, and painted the back wall deep rust red. The space began to look less like a garage and more like a heartbeat. Every so often, I'd get an email from someone asking if the Copper Lady could take on a custom job. The nickname stuck. People started stopping by just to watch me work, fascinated by the shower of sparks and the sound of molten steel cooling in water. I wasn't used to being watched, let alone admired. One day, a little girl stood at the doorway, eyes wide, and said, "You make fire into things?" I smiled and said, "Something like that." Business didn't explode overnight, but it grew steady. I learned how to quote jobs, how to source affordable materials, how to fix my own tools when they broke. Every mistake cost me money, but each one taught me something. When I mismeasured a railing by an inch and had to redo it from scratch, I stayed in the shop until sunrise, correcting every weld. The exhaustion didn't feel like failure. It felt like proof of progress. Still, there were hard days. There were times when the phone went silent for weeks, when I had to pawn my grandmother's ring to cover rent, when the exhaustion clawed so deep I questioned whether any of it was worth it. But then I'd see the gate at the cafe shining in the morning light, or I'd get a photo from a client showing how my railing caught the sunset just right, and it was enough to keep going. One rainy afternoon, a couple came in asking for a memorial bench to honor their late son, who had been a firefighter. They wanted something strong but soft, the mother said, like him. I built a bench with curved steel arms shaped like flames, each one rising upward as if reaching for the sky. When I delivered it, She ran her hand along the metal and whispered, "He would have loved this." She hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe. That was the day I understood that I wasn't just welding objects. I was building emotion into metal, turning grief and love and memory into something that would last longer than any of us. That night, as I locked up, I stood outside the shop and looked at the sign above the door. Copper and Flame. The paint had chipped a little, but under the dim streetlight, it glowed faintly. I thought of the first day I'd stood here, terrified and uncertain, and how far I'd come since then. I still didn't know what success would look like, but I knew this. Every scar on my hands, every sleepless night, every failed weld had shaped me into someone I barely recognized. A woman who had built something out of nothing. Someone who had turned the quiet ache of being unseen into a living flame. And as I walked to my truck, rain soaking through my jacket, I realized that for the first time in my life, I didn't feel small. I felt forged. It started with a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost ignored it, thinking it was another spammer trying to sell me an extended warranty for a car I no longer owned. But something in me hesitated, and when I answered, a bright, eager voice said, "Hi, is this Lena Porter? I'm calling from the Seattle Chronicle. We're doing a feature on small local businesses, women who are reshaping traditional trades, and your name came up." For a moment, I didn't know what to say. My name came up? In what universe? She laughed gently at my silence. "We'd love to visit your shop, maybe take a few photos, talk about your journey. I heard you've built something pretty special." A week later, a journalist named Megan walked into Copper and Flame on a Tuesday morning. She was younger than I expected, with a camera slung across her shoulder and an energy that filled the space. The shop was alive that day, metal sparks flying, Marisol humming softly as she welded, the radio buzzing in the background. Megan wandered around like a child in a museum, running her fingers along finished railings and intricate gates. "This is incredible," she said. "You built all this from scratch?" I nodded, suddenly shy. "Just me at first. Now it's us." She interviewed me for almost 2 hours, asked about my start, my inspiration, what it meant to work with my hands in a world obsessed with screens and comfort. I told her the truth. I told her about the cold mornings, the burns, the fear. I told her about the silence that used to surround every small victory, how I learned to celebrate myself because no one else would. When she asked me why I started Copper and Flame, I said, "Because I got tired of waiting to be invited to someone else's version of success." She didn't say anything at first, just stared at me, nodding slowly, like the words landed heavier than I intended. When she left, she hugged me and said, "I think people need to hear this." A week later, the article went live online and hit the weekend print edition. From Sparks to Success, How a Portland Welder Built Her Own Fire. It was surreal. There, on the front page of the lifestyle section, was a photo of me. Hair messy, cheeks smudged with soot, eyes fierce. Behind me, the shop glowed like a second heart. The comments online flooded in. People shared it, tagged friends I left messages that made me tear up in the middle of my lunch break. This made me cry. "My daughter's in trade school. Thank you for showing her this." Real work, real pride. But what I didn't expect was what came next. By noon that Saturday, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. I was in the middle of polishing a railing when I glanced at the screen. 5 missed calls from Mom, 3 from Dad, 1 from Ethan. Then a text. "We just saw the article. Why didn't you tell us? We're so proud of you." For a moment, I just stared at it. The irony hit like a wave. How fast pride can arrive once the world starts paying attention. My hands trembled, grease still clinging to my palms. I didn't reply. Not yet. An hour later, a silver sedan pulled up in front of the shop. I recognized it instantly. My parents. The sight of it made my stomach tighten. I wiped my hands on a rag and watched as they stepped out. Mom was dressed like she was going to church, wearing her pearl earrings and her company coat. Dad followed behind her, cautious, uncertain. They paused at the door, looking in at the space like tourists in a gallery. "Wow," Mom said. "This place is adorable. Adorable." The word hit wrong, like she was describing a kitten instead of the space I had bled into. I crossed my arms, leaned against the workbench. "Didn't expect visitors." "We had to see it in person," Dad said, eyes scanning the room. "You really built all this yourself?" I gave a small laugh. "No, the elves handled it." He smiled weakly, but the silence that followed hung heavy. Then Mom said, "We had no idea you were doing all of this. Why didn't you tell us?" I set down the rag, wiped my hands on my jeans. "Because the last time I told you something about welding, you asked if it was safe. Then you asked me to fix the garage latch." She blinked, caught off guard. "That's not fair. We were just worried about you." "Worried," I repeated, my voice quiet but sharp. "You threw Ethan a party when he got into law school. I got my certification, and you asked if I could fix something broken. You didn't even pretend to care." Dad sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "You know we've always supported you." "No," I said. "You supported me with errands. You supported Ethan with pride." For a long moment, no one spoke. The hum of the welding machine in the background filled the space between us. Then Dad took a small step forward, his eyes softer than I remembered. "I saw the piece in the paper," he said quietly. "That staircase you built, it's impressive. Really. I don't say that lightly." The honesty in his voice surprised me. I searched his face for sarcasm, but there was none, just quiet admiration that came years too late. Mom nodded beside him. "We're proud of you, Lena. Truly, we just want to be part of your life again." I looked around the shop, at the walls I'd painted, the tools I'd saved for, the smell of metal and hard work that filled every corner. This was my life. The version of me they'd ignored had built it. "You're welcome to visit," I said finally. "But I'm not shrinking myself again to fit your idea of success." They both nodded slowly, unsure what to say. It wasn't anger I felt anymore, just a strange calm, like finally exhaling after holding my breath for years. Before they left, Dad paused by the door. "You ever thought about making one of those big backyard smokers?" he asked. "Might be fun." I raised an eyebrow. "For you?" He half smiled. "Just asking." "Depends," I said. "You bringing brisket or just expectations?" He laughed, a real laugh, warm and awkward, and for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel forced. When they left, I stood in the doorway watching their car pull away, the sound of gravel crunching under the tires fading into the distance. The shop felt quiet again, but not empty. I glanced up at the newspaper clipping taped near the coffee maker. My face looked back at me, proud, strong, unashamed. For years, I had been waiting for them to see me, to acknowledge that I was more than just good with my hands. Now they had. But the victory didn't feel like I imagined it would. It wasn't fireworks or relief. It was steadier than that. That night, I stayed late, working on a new order, a decorative gate shaped like a flame rising into the air. As I welded the final seam, sparks scattering in a bright shower, I realized that the recognition I'd been chasing all my life had finally come. But it wasn't theirs I needed. It was mine. And that quiet truth felt more powerful than any applause. The months after the newspaper article felt like a slow thaw after a long winter. For the first time in years, I wasn't bracing myself against silence. Clients filled my inbox. Orders lined the walls. Copper and Flame was no longer just a dream I whispered to myself on cold nights. It was alive, pulsing with the rhythm of work and laughter and fire. Still, beneath the hum of grinders and the hiss of torches, I could feel something new stirring in me, a need to understand what it meant to live without performing for someone else's approval. I didn't realize how much of my life had been built around trying to be seen until I finally was. The recognition was nice, but fleeting, like sunlight through a dirty window. The real change came in quieter moments. The way I no longer flinched when my phone buzzed with my parents' names, or how I no longer imagined every success as a message I'd send to them for validation. My days became fuller, slower in the best way. I started taking time to breathe between projects. I began to see beauty not only in what I built, but in the stillness between each spark. Copper and Flame had grown faster than I could have planned. Marisol now worked nearly full-time, and she'd become more like a sister than an employee. Her kids sometimes played in the corner of the shop, drawing with chalk on the concrete floor. I'd watch them and think about the girl I used to be, the one who built tree houses out of scraps just to feel capable. I hoped that when those kids grew up, they'd never have to fight so hard to feel worthy. To celebrate our first profitable year, I decided to throw a small gathering. Not a party in the sense my parents would recognize. No hired bands, no speeches or champagne. Just a barbecue in the lot outside the shop. The smell of grilled ribs mixing with the metallic scent of iron and paint. I strung lights across the fence, borrowed folding tables from the cafe down the street, and invited the people who had stood beside me through the hardest days: Marisol and her family, Tanner from the cafe, a few clients who had become friends, and Wayne, my old instructor. When Wayne showed up, his beard had gone more gray than I remembered, but his grin was the same. He handed me a rusted wrench, wrapped in cloth. "It's cursed," he said, "but every welder I've ever taught who made it past year 1 gets it." I laughed, but I could see he was proud. He looked around the shop, whistled low, and said, "You've built more than a business here. You've built proof." That night was simple but perfect. The kids chased each other between the tables while we ate ribs and drank cheap beer from red cups. Laughter echoed through the lot, bouncing off the metal walls. There was no spotlight, no audience, just people who understood what it meant to create something from nothing. As the sun dropped behind the warehouses, the lights above us glowed gold. I remember looking around at all the faces, the ones covered in soot, the ones tired from long shifts, and realizing that this was the kind of celebration I had always wanted. Not for what I'd achieved, but for what I had survived. At one point, I slipped away to catch my breath and stood at the shop door, watching from a distance. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a message from my mom. "Saw the photos Wayne posted. Looks like a lovely gathering. We're happy for you, sweetheart." A moment later, Dad texted too. "Hope those ribs are the good kind. Maybe next time you'll invite us." For a second, I just stared at the screen. The old me would have felt torn between guilt and longing, maybe even typed out a quick invitation to make peace. But this time I just smiled and slipped the phone back into my pocket. It wasn't anger that stopped me. It was peace. I no longer needed them to show up to prove I was worth celebrating. I had already built my own circle of belonging. After everyone left, the lot was quiet again. A few paper plates rustled in the wind, and the last of the coals in the barbecue glowed faintly red. I sat on the shop steps, boots off, listening to the city hum in the distance. The night air was cool and smelled faintly of smoke and rain. Bruno, the old mutt Wayne, had brought over one winter as a shop guard dog, curled up beside me, snoring softly. It hit me then. Healing isn't about rewriting the past. It's about learning how to live with it without letting it steer you. My parents' lack of celebration used to feel like a wound I couldn't stop touching. But now, it just felt like an old scar, a mark that proved something had once hurt and then healed. I didn't need to erase it. It was part of my story. Inside, the shop lights were still on. I could see the projects lined up on the benches, the curved steel railing for a new client, a half-finished sculpture Marisol and I had been tinkering with. Every piece told a story of persistence. Every weld was a small act of defiance against the version of myself that once believed I needed someone else's permission to matter. I thought of Ethan, too. We hadn't spoken much since my parents' visit, though he'd sent a message the week before. "Saw another article about you. Looks like you're doing great. Maybe I'll stop by next time I'm in town." It was brief, polite, cautious. The kind of message you send when you're trying to rebuild a bridge without knowing if the other side is still standing. I didn't respond right away. I wasn't angry at him anymore. The truth was, he had been trapped in a different kind of expectation, one that demanded perfection instead of invisibility. We'd both spent years trying to earn applause for entirely different reasons. That realization softened something in me. The jealousy, the resentment, it all felt outdated now, like a story I'd outgrown. I didn't need to compete anymore. I didn't need to prove I was worthy of the same praise he'd been given automatically. I had built something of my own, something rooted in purpose, not performance. When I finally went back inside, the warmth from the shop heater hit me like a quiet embrace. I turned off the lights one by one until only the sign above the door remained glowing. Copper and Flame. The paint was chipped, the letters slightly crooked, but it was mine. I ran my fingers over the steel letters and whispered, "We did all right, didn't we?" The next morning I came in early, long before the sun rose. I made a pot of coffee, fed Bruno, and stood by the front window watching the first light break over the wet streets. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt earned. Healing, I realized, doesn't always come with forgiveness or fanfare. Sometimes it's just the quiet understanding that you've survived the parts of your life that tried to make you small, and you're still standing taller than ever. I wasn't performing anymore. I wasn't chasing applause. I was home, right there in the hum of the machines and the steady breath of a sleeping dog. And for the first time, that felt like enough. Spring arrived in Portland the way it always does, slowly, stubbornly, like the city wasn't quite ready to let go of its gray. The air smelled of wet concrete and fresh beginnings, the kind that didn't announce themselves with fanfare, but slipped in quietly like forgiveness. At Copper and Flame, the rhythm of life had settled into something steady and strong. The shop no longer echoed with emptiness. It breathed, alive with movement, conversation, and the soft clang of metal against metal. Every morning, I'd walk through the door, coffee in one hand, glove in the other, greeted by the sight of Marisol already bent over a new project and Bruno snoring in his bed beside the heater. The back wall of the shop had changed over the months. It now held framed photos of our earliest builds: the cafe gate, the firefighter's bench, the railing that caught the sunset just right. Above them, I had welded a new sign from brushed steel letters: "You don't need permission to matter." The quote wasn't mine. Wayne had said it once after too many beers, but it had stayed with me. Now it gleamed across the wall like a promise to everyone who walked through the door, including me. Running the shop had become less about survival and more about legacy. I didn't mean legacy in the way my parents used to talk about it: family names, careers, reputation. Mine was quieter but no less real. It was in the hands that came through my doors, learning the trade the way I had, finding their own strength through fire and grit. One of those hands belonged to Eli, a high school senior who came to shadow us for a semester. He was shy, all elbows and hesitation, reminding me so much of myself at his age that it almost hurt. He'd ask endless questions about every machine, every tool, his curiosity shining through every spark. Watching him learn felt like passing forward something sacred. One Friday evening, while Eli packed up his tools, he turned to me and said, "Miss Porter, do you ever get tired of it? The noise, the burns, the long hours?" I smiled, wiping sweat from my forehead. "Every day," I told him. "But I also wake up every morning knowing I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. That makes it worth it." He nodded thoughtfully, as if he understood more than his years should allow. That moment stayed with me. My parents came by a few times that spring. Not unannounced this time. They called first, their voices softer than before. They brought a lemon pie once, the same kind my mom used to bake for holidays. She set it on the counter and said, "We thought you might like something sweet after all that heavy metal." My dad chuckled at his own joke. They stayed for coffee, asked questions about the shop, and I could see something new in their eyes. Curiosity, not condescension. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. I showed them around, introduced them to Marisol and Eli, and even let Dad hold a welding mask for a photo. Before they left, my mom looked around the shop, her gaze landing on the steel quote on the wall. "You don't need permission to matter," she read aloud. "That's beautiful." Her voice cracked slightly, and for a fleeting second, I saw a woman who finally understood the daughter she'd spent years overlooking. "I'm proud of you, Lena," she said quietly. This time, I didn't doubt that she meant it. Ethan called not long after. He'd gone back to finish law school, but something in his tone was different, less polished, less sure. "I saw that post about your shop expanding," he said. "You're really doing it, huh?" I laughed. "Trying to." There was a pause, and then he added, "You know, sometimes I think you figured it out before the rest of us did. You actually look happy in those pictures." It caught me off guard. For years, we danced around each other's successes like rivals pretending to be cousins. "You can say it," I told him. "You just have to mean it." He laughed, the sound genuine and a little embarrassed. "You did good, Lena," he said. "Really good." I didn't need the words, but hearing them felt like a gentle closing of an old wound. As the shop grew, I began thinking about the future, not just mine, but the kind of mark I wanted Copper and Flame to leave behind. I wanted it to be more than a business. I wanted it to be a place where people could walk in feeling small and walk out realizing they were capable of building something strong. I started a small apprenticeship program for students from the trade school, kids who couldn't afford the fancy routes but had fire in their eyes. I told them what Wayne once told me: this job will humble you, but it'll also set you free. There were still quiet nights when I'd stay long after everyone else had gone home. I'd turn off the machines, let the silence settle, and sit at my workbench with a cup of coffee gone cold. The shop, in those hours, felt like an old friend, scarred, imperfect, but full of life. Sometimes I'd flip through the old photos from the early days, the peeling paint, the broken lights, my nervous grin in front of the "For Lease" sign, and I'd marvel at how far I'd come. One evening, as I was closing up, a young couple pulled into the lot. They'd seen the article that had gone around again online. Someone had reshared the old Seattle Chronicle story with a caption that read, "Where are they now?" The woman said she wanted a piece for their new home, something strong and beautiful. I built them a custom fire pit shaped like a blooming flower, each petal made of copper and steel. When they came to pick it up, the woman ran her hand over the edge and whispered, "It feels alive." That simple sentence filled me with the same warmth I'd felt the day I welded my first perfect seam. On the 1-year anniversary of that first newspaper feature, I locked up early. The sun was setting behind the hills, streaking the sky with orange and pink. I sat on the front step with Bruno beside me, watching the colors fade into dusk. The sound of cars on the highway hummed like a lullaby, and the smell of metal and rain clung to the air. I thought about all the versions of myself I'd been: the little girl building tree houses, the woman eating gas station pie alone in her car, the welder with calloused hands and a heart that refused to quit. They were all still here, fused together by time and stubbornness. For a long time, I had believed success meant being seen. But sitting there under the bruised sky, I realized it wasn't about visibility, it was about impact. The gates I'd built, the benches, the sculptures, they would outlast me. The people I'd taught would carry pieces of my fire with them. That was enough. That was everything. When I finally went inside, I turned off the last light and ran my hand over the steel letters on the wall. They were cool to the touch, solid, unyielding. I smiled and whispered, "We built something that lasts." Legacy, I realized, isn't carved in stone or printed in papers. It's forged in the quiet persistence of showing up, in the courage to build when no one is watching, in the willingness to keep the fire burning, not for applause, but for the simple, beautiful act of creation. And as the darkness settled over the shop, I felt it, the warmth of something eternal still glowing in the ashes. Lena Porter's story is one of quiet defiance, hard-earned transformation, and the kind of redemption that doesn't need an audience. She began as the overlooked girl in a family that worshipped perfection and prestige, where her cousins' every achievement was celebrated, while her own were dismissed as useful. But when the silence of invisibility became too heavy to bear, she didn't fight for their attention. She built her own. With nothing but determination, a torch, and blistered hands, Lena created Copper and Flame, a welding shop born not from privilege, but from persistence. What started as a dream in a rusted garage grew into a thriving symbol of self-worth. Over time, her craft became her voice, her work became her healing, and her legacy became proof that recognition means nothing unless it's rooted in authenticity. Through fire, loneliness, and resilience, Lena learned the most important lesson of all: you don't need permission to matter. In a world that constantly measures success by applause and visibility, her journey reminds us that the most powerful validation comes from within. The takeaway is simple yet profound. Stop waiting for others to see your worth. Build your life, your dream, your art, your peace, until it's impossible for anyone, including yourself, to ignore what you've created. Whether your version of welding is starting a business, healing from rejection, or chasing a passion you've hidden for years, start now. Let the fire that once burned you become the fire that forges you. Quick question for you. If no one ever noticed your success, would you still keep building? A, yes, because meaning matters more than applause. B, no, because recognition is what keeps me going. Comment A or B below and tell us why. What's your take on Lena's story? Do you believe we can find fulfillment without validation from others? Let's hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you felt something from this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel so we can keep bringing you more stories that light a spark where you need it most.